Good afternoon. My name is Tom Sugrue, and I'm the director of the Penn Social Science and Policy Forum, and I welcome you to this afternoon's workshop. This workshop is part of an ongoing series this year dealing with questions of immigration and citizenship. And I know many of you have been to our previous events this semester. We've had a mix of people from across disciplines, a roundtable session on immigration reform. We've had a historian, a sociologist, a political scientist, today an anthropologist, all engaging questions of contemporary relevance through cutting-edge research in one of many different social sciences. Before I introduce this afternoon's speaker, I do want to invite you all to our last presentation this semester, which will be here 1 week from today, very same time at noon. Dimitrios Papadimitriou, who's the head of the Migration Policy Institute, will be coming to talk about getting comprehensive immigration reform right. In the spring semester, we have a lot of very interesting speakers coming through, and I'll just draw your attention to the first of the spring semester at the very end of January, when we'll have Maria Cristina Garcia from Cornell, who will be both doing a large public lecture and a smaller workshop here in the very last week of January, the Thursday and Friday, on different aspects of her ongoing research on refugee policy. So we've got a great lineup, and there are many more to come. If you are not members of the Penn Social Science and Policy Forum listserv, we have a sign-up sheet. You can sign up to make sure that you're updated to our ongoing events. In addition, you can register for our mailing list on our webpage, and you can also friend us on Facebook and get an update on ongoing events on our Facebook page. So, with no further ado, I am delighted to introduce this afternoon's speaker, Professor Anya Ramos-Zayas. She's a professor in the Department of Black and Latino Studies at Baruch College, CUNY, and in the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center. She also holds the Valentin Lizana y Chair in Latin American Studies. She has her BA in Economics from Yale and an MA and PhD in Anthropology from Columbia. And as you will see, her work really crosses in very interesting interdisciplinary ways between consideration of large-scale structural political economic questions and very detailed on-the-ground ethnographic approach driven by anthropologists. She's author of a number of important books, including National Performances, Class, Race, and Space in Puerto Rican Chicago, Street Therapists, Affect, Race, and Neoliberal Personhood in Latino Newark, and she's the co-author of Latino Crossings, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, and the Politics of Race and Citizenship. She's also authored numerous journal articles and considering questions of youth culture, race and critical race theory, citizenship and migration, and the anthropology of emotion and affect. Mostly from a geopolitical focus that centers on Latino and Latin American populations, particularly Brazilians and Puerto Ricans, Dr. Ramos-Zayas' work is comparative and ethnographic in nature. She's currently working on a new book project, tentatively titled Effective Privilege, Affluence, Race, and Parenting in Ipanema, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and El Condado, San Juan, Puerto Rico. In this work, she's drawn from ethnographic field work in these two affluent Latin American neighborhoods. And she's hoping to gain insight into the ways in which parenting ideologies are articulated in the context of global privilege and global neoliberal anxieties. She's also co-authoring a methodological piece on the challenges and productive potential of examining economies of affect in relation to racialization theories. So, bringing together the macro and the micro, looking at questions of social justice and the intersection of intimate worlds and political economic structures are really the fundamental concerns in your scholarship, and I think will be the focus of today's presentation. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much for the great presentation and for having me here. I'm really excited to visit and to share some of the work with you today. There are a few things that I wanted to do today, and I just want to sort of like give you an overview of what I'll be doing. I mean, I think in part I'm doing it this way because I feel like because of the time limit, I'm not going to be able to give as much context as I'd like to give, because I think context is so fundamental to what I'm talking about. It's more than context, and yet I won't be able to do too much of that. So I just wanted to make sure that I sort of lead you in the way that I've been thinking through this, even if I can't give you all the information, the background information. So what I wanted to do in this presentation in particular is first give you a little bit of an overview and maybe go over the outline of the chapters of street therapists, because street therapists have served as the stepping stone to the presentation that I'm giving today. So what I'm going to be talking about today is it's transnational urban competencies and returned migrant youth, the politics of affect and race in Belo Horizonte and Santurce. But this is part of some data that I was not able to include explicitly or in any great length in the book, but it is influenced by the book. So I just wanted to, that's why I'm giving the overview of the chapter outline first, and then going into the return migration piece. And as a conclusion, I wanted to talk a little bit about the project that I'm working on now, just not because it has any relationship to the return migration, but just because I'm excited about it and I feel like, okay, I'm like in this other place and it would be nice to get any feedback. So that's just for my own selfish reasons that I'm including that piece. Okay, so the presentation that I have for today is a spin-off of the last chapter of my book, Street Therapists. In the book, I break down the book into 6 chapters that are really start with an ethnographic episode and then go into deconstructing that episode in light of other contextual elements of the chapter. So in the book chapters, I talk about, well, these are some of the book chapters, but I'm going to start reading and I'll leave you with the chapter titles and then give you a little bit more on each. But I'm going to start with 2 quotes. The first quote is by Ana Teresa Botel, who's 19, and she's Brazilian and lives in the Ironbound section of Newark. And she says, quote, "The first thing that I learned here in the United States was the trouble with black people. You're looking at someone and they're like, what are you looking at? Very antagonistic, aggressive, and don't think it's the guys I'm talking about. No, it's the women. And you can't show them you're afraid because they'll fight you even more. They're like guys," end of quote. And now I want to continue with another quote from a Puerto Rican woman who's 18. Her name is Migdalia Rivera. She was born in the North Broadway, which is the predominantly Puerto Rican section of Newark. And she says, quote, "I think Hispanic families are very open. They will accept anyone as long as they give us respect. Because we are ourselves racially mixed. So we're used to that. My aunt is married to a black guy, and my family is crazy about him. He eats our food, dances salsa, he always says a few words in Spanish. It's harder with the black women, because they get very jealous of us. They think we steal their men. Because you see more couples of a black man and a Puerto Rican woman than the other way around. They can be very aggressive." End of quote. Like other Newark residents with whom I spoke over the years, Ana Teresa and Migdalia formulated a characterization of blackness as a deeply emotive and gendered idiom, sometimes appraised in a visceral and spectacular way, not unlike an audience's response to an over-the-top, exaggerated television talk show. In the context of Newark, Latinos sometimes attributed negative emotions to African Americans, particularly African American women, and assumed that the race of blacks as a social unit explained aggression and perspectives on having attitude in ways that increase distrust and uncertainty in everyday interactions. Nevertheless, young Latinos and Latin American migrants also recognized that African Americans sometimes possessed a desired form of urban competency and the modernity, hipness, and cosmopolitanism globally associated with blackness. Acquiring and internalizing the knowledge of how race operated in social exchanges became a deeply emotive process for Latinos in Newark, as individuals both phenomenologically experienced these emotions and projected them onto others as a way of to render them legible. Quotidian interactions in schools, neighborhoods, commercial venues, and the streets and public transportation oftentimes propel a therapeutic and even psychoanalytic engagement, a heightened gaze of black bodies and mannerisms. These interactions and the historical, political, and economic context that enabled them constituted what I came to view as an urban emotional common sense. Although a focus on this urban affective dynamics was not the initial impetus for this ethnography, the empirical centrality of this theme over the 10 years in which I was engaging in the ethnographic project, and the empirical centrality of this theme allowed me to examine how certain historical events and political economic structures came to mark cities and generate a visceral, emotive perception of everyday lived space and transnational elsewheres. Urban spaces became, in very explicit ways, humanized, and the humanity of city residents became contingent upon the adequate manifestation of affect and emotive practices in this context. In Newark, aggression, the trope of aggression, frequently served as a meta-sentiment that dominated quasi-therapeutic readings and assessments of emotional adequacy. Fred Myers used the term meta-sentiment to refer to a specific regulatory emotion that some communities place outside the person, as a control feeling to teach individuals what to feel and what not to feel, what kind of self to be and not be. Significantly, however, reading this urban meta-sentiment cannot be reduced to learning what Elijah Anderson called the code of the streets. Rather, reading affect in an urban context also requires an assessment of how therapeutic scrutiny and emotional analysis in fact propel the resurrection of alternative racialization practices, including, in the case of Latinos in Newark, the deployment of a Latin American ideology of racial democracy. It was through the articulation of a US-based cartography of racial democracy that Latin American migrants and US-born Latinos alike assumed a higher moral emotive ground in contradistinction to a presumed African American aggressiveness or having attitude, or the blandness and traditionalism and lack of sensuality attributed to whites, and in the context of Newark, the whites were mostly Portuguese. The concept of street therapies, as established in the title of the ethnography, enabled a preliminary formulation of an emotion-based theory of practice that is grounded on relational affect and knowledge sharing, rather than in any intrinsic biocultural trait. I specified that these are street therapies as opposed to a conventional form of therapy that might happen in traditional institutional settings, to highlight how all individuals involved in the therapeutic process implicitly viewed themselves, others, and the nature of their relationship in light of historically constituted and constituting material practices and urban social hierarchies and aesthetics. Street therapies are not mere observers, but are effectively engaged in the tacit and explicit social knowledge that constitutes the practices of multiple relations in which they become involved. As they gradually master these practices and perhaps become practitioners themselves, their legitimacy and competency in urban spaces increase. These processes of observation, analysis, and learning, however, did not refer to some monolithic preordained acquisition of a culture. Rather, they were inclusive, historically grounded, and continuously unfolding, and included a continuous engagement with what others do, how they talk, walk, and act. That is, it was a process by which Latinos learned what they needed to do to be successful in the elusive process of belonging in a local, national, and international scale. Manifesting an emotional common sense that was suitable for the Newark urban context required, among other things, that Latinos became racial experts and street therapists dedicated to scrutinizing, analyzing, and selectively emulating features of a cosmopolitan urban blackness, while carefully avoiding an over-identification with African Americans, and in the case of Brazilians living in the Ironbound, even with working-class Portuguese whites. Emotive urban interactions are technologies of self-management, relying extensively on language and the mastery of proper racial etiquette and racial talk, a challenge for Latin American migrants who sometimes consider engaging in race talk as a racist act in itself, as we know from Robin Sherriff's work. By reducing personality and emotions into new forms of social classification, many Latino and Latin Americans contributed to making emotional style, historically the professional realm of psychologists and the medical profession, a social currency, a form of neoliberal personhood, while articulating a new language of racial selfhood and dovetailed with urban renewal needs in Newark. And in the book, I talk extensively about the Newark Renaissance and what these neoliberal projects are, and specifically what I mean by the policy implications of these projects. And I'm doing that here. The comments by Ana Teresa and Migdali at the beginning that opened this presentation have to be situated in light of several conversations we had in which they insisted that U.S. Latinos and Latin American migrants possess different perceptions of race than did African Americans, that they were more accepting of racial difference than blacks in the United States, or did not even consider race as a valid analytical category to begin with, that they had, quote, every race or racial group represented in their own families and kin networks, or that their very nationalities were a product of 3 ancestral bloodlines, as evidenced by the various combinations of looks common to one's countries of origin or ancestry. These claims resonate in obvious ways with long debated and quite normative views of Latin American racial democracy. What was perhaps different about the comments above and those gathered through much of the fieldwork in Newark was how discussions of racial democracy were activated by the perceived volatility, uncertainty, and general illegibility of everyday racial situations involving African Americans. Latinos deployed these ideologies of racial mixture to highlight a higher emotive and affective modern personhood that was viewed as radically different from the presumed inadequate affect of African Americans and in general, and particularly of African American women. The terms of anti-discrimination struggles enabled by this cartography were fundamentally different from, and at times incompatible with, classic civil rights-inspired anti-racism discourse that views race as a language and identity of collective rights. In fact, many Latin American migrants and some US-born Latinos oftentimes view such denunciations as symptomatic of emotional or even psychological inadequacy. For example, like conversations about being lazy, tener complejo, having low self-esteem, too much anger, being too aggressive. All of these were conversations that whenever I would ask either Brazilians or the US-born Puerto Ricans that I was interviewing to describe colleagues at work or to describe people that they interacted with, those were the comments and the characterizations that would be dominant in those conversations. A critical element of this cartography of racial democracy is that the nation state and US racial history do not provide the critical lens through which Latin American migrants and many US-born Latinos view race or racism. Instead, the realm of affect and intimate knowledge were the narrative supplied as leading evidence that racism does not exist among Latinos, or that denunciations of racism would actually lead to government-induced social change. In this sense, the manifestation of racial democracy discourses in the United States called us to analyze what Ann Stoller calls intimate frontiers, how the workings of intimate domains are also implicated in the managing of white supremacy, racial subordination, and difference in a highly nativist homeland security state. As I was saying before, in Street Therapies, I organized the ideas that I have outlined so far around a series of ethnographic episodes that, when taken together, provided insight into Newark's emotional and racial landscape and racialized affect practices more broadly. Building upon the theoretical framework grounded on the concept of urban emotive common sense, cartography of racial democracy, and neoliberal personhood, each of these episodes in each chapter deconstructed, analyzed, and was situated in broader political, economic, and historical context. In the first chapter, I dedicated the chapter to, as I said before, to talk about Newark and the changes that Newark has experienced as part of what it was called the Newark Renaissance, which are different kinds of neoliberal practices to draw tourism and capital to Newark. In the second chapter, I focused more on the neighborhood where most Puerto Ricans live and how a politics of worthiness developed along Puerto Rican citizenship, particularly since Puerto Rican citizenship has historically been considered a delinquent U.S. citizenship. Puerto Ricans, on the one hand, are U.S. citizens, but they are always viewed in a very suspicious way, and a higher number of young people joining the military and deploying ideas of worthiness became very prominent during this particular time of my fieldwork. In chapter 3, I focus more explicitly on a cartography of racial democracy by focusing on the elusive Brazilian Newark, the area specifically of the Ironbound, that used to be a predominantly Portuguese area, but in the 1980s, the demographics turned a little bit and more Brazilians were living and working in that area. In chapter 4, I talk more about the specific stereotypes and the subtext and narrative forms that from which those stereotypes actually also draw. And I focus more like the real life telenovelas, issues of who's stealing whose husband, and that kind of like conversation that was so very frequent during the time of my field work. The next chapter, I focus more on the idea of aggression as part of a city and a sexualized, and as part of a sexuality of aggression in the city. And the many discussions of black, lesbian, and women, and speculations around black women's sexuality. And the work that I'm going to present for the rest of the presentation today is a spin-off of the very last chapter, which is titled Learning Affect, Embodying Race, Cosmopolitan Competency and Urban Emotional Epistemologies. And this is a chapter that begins with a vignette involving a young Brazilian woman who comments on how an Ecuadorian male classmate of hers, this is in a high school, has gone from being a happy immigrant kid to becoming a depressed thought. This final chapter shows how mastering negative affect, particularly certain expressions of depression, seriousness, anxiety, and isolation, was a fundamental aspect of the Americanization process among certain Latin American groups as they became racialized as U.S. minorities. And this is particularly the case more among the most marginal of the marginal in the scope of the pecking order of a high school. So the new Mexican kid that just showed up with the shiny shoes, you know, that kind of, and very nice kid, you know, that kind of like, oh my God, you are so not part of us, right? So it's how those transformations are appraised as this particular kid becomes Americanized in a particular way. At the center of this chapter, this last chapter, is the process of racial learning as a way to understand how US-born Latino and Latin American migrants oftentimes become street therapists that delve into the emotional lives of African Americans and also more recent migrants as they theorize and learn about US racializing processes. In this last chapter, I also include some data on the life experiences of Brazilians and Puerto Ricans who return to their countries of origin or ancestry, particularly Belo Horizonte, the capital of the state of Minas Gerais in Brazil, and Santurce, an area of San Juan, Puerto Rico. And I do this because towards the last part of my field work, many of the Brazilian kids that I had met who were no longer students, they had already graduated, were returning with their families back to Brazil. For many reasons, including the economic changes here in the U.S., deportation issues, and so forth. And there was also a big move of Puerto Ricans back and forth, I mean, going for a few months to live in Puerto Rico and coming back, that felt, that had increased during that time. So I sort of felt that I needed to know a little bit what that was about. So that part I didn't fully include in this book, but I'm working on co-authoring an article that elaborates on this part and talks more about it. So I want to present that one as in the next part of the talk, and then and then I'll tell you a little bit more about my current work. So although different, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about the return migrants here. Although differently perceived in Brazil and Puerto Rico, return migrants in both countries frequently became the embodiment of a negative affect, very similar to the one that I witnessed in Newark with the recent arrivals. They were viewed as depressed, withdrawn, aloof, selfish, or even angry and aggressive themselves. The so-called Nuyorican in Puerto Rico and the Brazuca in Brazil frequently animated local class and racial hierarchies as they often became embodiment of a failed or abject Americanization upon returning to their countries of origin. At the time of my fieldwork in Belo Horizonte, most of the fieldwork in Belo Horizonte was done around 2004 to 2006, and I've been there maybe like a couple times after that, so it hasn't been tremendously recent. But Brazil's economy experienced significant growth at the time when the US and many European nations had fallen into dramatic recessions. Nevertheless, the city of Belo Horizonte proper, where the young people with whom I spoke lived, and where they attended school when they went back, and the smaller neighboring towns like Valadares, and if you're familiar with Minas Gerais, there are many small little towns that have a very high percentage of migrants. But those towns were not fully benefiting from the economic upturn of Brazil, partly because they had depended so much on the remittances from the U.S., so that when the economic crisis in the U.S. happened, those towns in fact suffered, even though they were in Brazil. While migration has been a relatively recent and tangential phenomenon in Brazilian history, and Brazilians always talk of themselves as a country of immigrants, just like the U.S., it has been a leading strategy in Puerto Rico's rapid industrialization and economic development project since Operation Bootstraps in the 40s to the 60s. And it has been also ubiquitous to the fabric of life in Puerto Rican society. So migration has really played a very different role in each one of these countries. It has been estimated that currently the Puerto Rican population living in the U.S. has surpassed that of the island. So Belo Horizonte and Santurce, and I will say San Juan, but it's a Santurce neighborhood within San Juan. Belo Horizonte and Santurce are undoubtedly complex geographical, physical, and social spaces with unique histories, political economics, relationships to global migration, labor, and market configurations. And a more detailed analysis of the nuances of each city, although beyond the scope of this presentation, it's obviously important in highlighting that the city also provides a very constitutive foundation for the research that I've done. My research focused mostly on 4 high schools, 2 private and 2 public in each one of the 2 places, and that is where I interviewed most of the students. In the case of the Brazilian students that I interviewed in Belo Horizonte, they had lived in Newark, many of them, and this was a high school where about 3 of the students that I interviewed in Belo Horizonte actually attended before moving to Newark. In the case of Puerto Rico, I focused on the high school that had the highest number of returned migrants because it had a bilingual English-Spanish program. Upon returning to their communities of origin or ancestry, Brazilian and Puerto Rican youth, the so-called Brazucas and Nuyorican, were not only considered inauthentic and impure, which we know from other literature, but more significantly, they were considered depressed, narcissistic, aggressive, selfish. These characteristics were developed against a context of a presumed American affect. In Brazil and Puerto Rico, Americans were often described as orderly, disciplined, and focused, in contradistinction to the disorder and chaos associated with these returned migrants. Thus, while Nuyorican and Brazucas were considered Americanized, their style of Americanization was exceptional in that it lacked the order and discipline associated with the U.S. In fact, Nuyorican and Brazucas were illustrative of an abject or failed Americanization process. They were ensconced in an order-disorder diet that connected perspective of American affect as orderly, if bland and uncreative, and third world emotive landscapes that were characterized as disorderly and inefficient but ingenious. Returned migrants were tacitly required to learn a way of existing in these third world countries where efficiency and order did not necessarily supersede an enduring resilience, emotional ease, and a local creativity. I introduced 2 terms that were two set of terms that were very prominent during the fieldwork. While conducting fieldwork in Puerto Rico, I was surprised by the frequent use of the term algarete, particularly in relation to Nuyorican. Roughly translated as being in a state of agitated disorder or chaos, or lacking self-control, algarete was a consistently used term in conversations about migrants in general and returned migrants from the U.S. in particular. Having grown up in Puerto Rico, I had heard the term before. Even back in the 1980s, the term had struck me as dated and belonging to an older generation, and not one that was very popular among other island youth. Nevertheless, while conducting fieldwork in Puerto Rico in 2005 and 2006, it was as if there had been an explosion in the usage of this term in relation to migrants from other countries to Puerto Rico, like especially from the Dominican Republic, but also in relation to returned migrants to Puerto Rico from the U.S. And Neris, a student in the Santurce Public School where I did my interviews, used algarete while alluding to issues related to family dynamics and drawing on examples from her own extended family. This is a quote. The main difference between Puerto Ricans raised on the island and those that come from the U.S. is that their people are more algarete. They are wild, do whatever they want. My cousins were born and raised in New York, and I don't understand them. Not only because of the language, but also they're interested in other things, involving drugs. I mean, it's not that people don't do drugs here, but there is bigger. Here we're a tiny island and we have problems. Imagine there. Return migrants themselves also use the term algarete in similar ways to how these non-migrants did. What is worth noting, given the affective qualities suggested by the term, is that returned migrants understood their life in Puerto Rico as one that required intensive emotional management. As if in those 4-hour trip between New York or Newark and Puerto Rico, they had to already start preparing to deal with what was coming. And people describe this 4-hour plane ride in very powerful and visceral ways. They themselves assumed that the algarete they presumably brought from the US needed to be controlled, and oftentimes assumed that controlling being algarete was one of the main motivations behind their parents' move to Puerto Rico. Algarete and the emotional management required of many returned migrants in Puerto Rico were often embroiled in a language of trauma and aggression. A bilingual class teacher in the Santurce Public School, Carla Rosario, said of New York students, quote, "Because they come from schools in the US where they had to defend themselves, they carry those traumatic experiences. We had a girl that would always wear a big bun in her hair so she could conceal blades there. We asked her about that, and she said that she was just protecting herself," end of quote. Carla was among the many interviewees, teachers and students alike, in both the private and public schools in Puerto Rico who characterized the adjustment of returned migrants as traumatic, and who considered the returnees to have issues like low self-esteem, anger issues, and there was a prolific vocabulary of all sorts of kind of trickle-down therapeutic terms that obviously are very much also part of our pop psych culture, and people have just sort of adopted into their vocabulary, but they were very much circulated and used to characterize something that did not enable any kind of connection to the context that these people are coming from or what happened in life before they arrived. Like in San Juan, among youth in Belo Horizonte, discussions of migration and return migration deployed epistemologies that focused on the returnee in psychological and emotive terms. While some Brazilian migrants were portrayed as impulsive, selfish, disloyal, or fora de si, which was the equivalent of algarete, actually. I have it over there. It's very comparable, which is very interesting. Others were judged in terms of how they had kept their social, economic, and affective ties to their family and local communities while abroad. These returned migrants at times laid claim to a cosmopolitanism and urban competency acquired in the US. Nevertheless, the image of the brazuca, like that one of the New Yorker, was still saturated with this negative psychological underpinnings, as they were often marginalized in their communities of origin and ancestry based on a negative affect associated with them, and the claim that it's impossible to relate to them. So it was almost like this relational impossibility that other students described. Terms suggestive of disorder, like algarete or fora de si, and images of selfishness, impulsivity, narcissism, or anger were often associated with being a migrant, but more often with being a failed migrant to the US, a failed Americanization distinct for a dominant Americanness that was assumed to be efficient, entrepreneurial, and orderly. This perspective on order and disorder existed alongside an enduring narrative of third world creativity, as I mentioned before. While in the US things were done more orderly and efficiently, this efficiency was presumed to be at the expense of resilience, creativity, or a richer emotive world. So locally, Brazilians and Puerto Ricans used a domestic way of handling hardship that did not require buying into a US efficient yet bland way of experiencing the world. And this was yet another way in which local populations view themselves as different and having certain emotional mastery and skills that these other returned migrants lacked, by the fact that they were more in tune with this third world emotive landscape. Oftentimes, reincorporation into countries of origin or ancestry was in fact a self-defensive process that required the New Yorker or Brazucas to render themselves legible to others, readjust their views and language to those of the local context, and gain a cultural intimacy that was required to understand, literally and metaphorically, how things work in their countries of origin or ancestry. When returned migrants arrived in Puerto Rico and Brazil, they were usually evaluated in terms of how they navigated situations that required mastery of an implicit social knowledge and know-how, which was known as bregar in Puerto Rico and se virar in Brazil. Implicit in bregar and se virar is that one knows how to navigate inconveniences associated with third world countries. Frequent power outages, waiting in long lines for services, unreliable public transportation, without getting angry or impatient or drawing comparisons with how life in the US used to be. Se virar required a capacity to transform disorienting aspects of everyday life and quotidian hassles into psychological resources, to know what to ask of whom, where, and how to react to what you encounter were all part of se virar. As Danubia, public school student in Belo Horizonte, explained, se virar, quote, "It is when you have to find a different way of doing things, to act in a way to accomplish something and change something in your life." End of quote. Se virar in Brazil resonates with bregar in Puerto Rico. In El Arte de Bregar, cultural theorist Arcadio Díaz-Quiñones defined bregar as, quote, a very practical line of conduct that allows survival with certain dignity, even when it might mean pretending theatrically that something has been resolved. End of quote. In the case of Puerto Rico, Díaz-Quiñones argues, bregar suggests the ability to navigate the context of US colonialism while preserving a sense of agency and resilience. Se virar and bregar implicitly serve to distinguish non-immigrant Brazilian and Puerto Rican populations, those who make things work in face of adversity, from the presumably rigid American whites or the fora de si and return migrants. Bregar and se virar drew from perspectives on trust, self-control, intentionality, obligation, and reciprocity, while aiming to avoid the compulsivity and greed attributed to brazucas and the aggressiveness and nonconformity associated with the new region. The challenge for return migrants was to learn to bregar and se virar, and ultimately to exist, behave, and feel in ways that were consistent with local expectations and which require a great deal of emotional work and self-management. In Brazil, students who had never migrated generally pointed to Luis Leo, and a couple of other students like Luis Leo who had returned within a year, as evidence of how migration makes you depressed. Even the most self-reflective and compassionate Brazilian students often commented that returned migrants like Luis Leo were somber, withdrawn, and disengaged because they had never adapted to their environment, whether in the US or back in Brazil. In these other students' views, returned migrants did not know how to se virar. When I expressed my interest in interviewing returned migrants and asked for suggestions, Isabel and Danubia, these two students at the public school, warned me, quote, "You'll never get Luis Leo to talk. He just stays in his own corner and talks to nobody." As I got to know Luis Leo and other returned migrants better, I understood the extent to which class talk required an exhaustive commitment to adopting effective identities that demanded great emotional labor. For the returned migrant students, class and the possibility of performing the return as a rags to riches tale had been curtailed by local demands to define class along a well-established, dramatized social axis that was not as susceptible to conventional American mythologies of meritocracy and the American dream. And interestingly enough, students were tremendously sophisticated in their discussions and conversations about race, which is something a little counterintuitive in all the other research that suggests that in Brazil, people don't talk about race. Well, especially the private school students, and for many reasons that we can probably imagine, were very conversant and they were very at ease with these discussions of race. They were less at ease actually with discussions of class. And that will leave me sort of have a little bit of intrigue. I was intrigued by that, and I'll tell you more about it short in a little bit. Even in the few cases where returned migrants showed increased purchasing power by buying real estate or having fancy cars or clothes, they still remain outside mainstream social networks that granted status and prestige. A model of emotional deficiency frequently dominated local characterizations of these migrants, as I've said, as individuals whose capacity to adapt both to life in mainstream US and in Brazil were questioned. For many local Brazilians, particularly Brazilian youth who had little input in their family decisions to migrate or return, this meant that their migration experience had been a failure, and they themselves questioned their national belonging. The returnees, like Luis Leo in many cases, had actually adopted a rather American view of classlessness and meritocracy, so they were uncomfortable participating in explicit conversations about class in the same way that the local students asked them to manifest those expressions. While Brazucas like Luis Leo found themselves struggling to learn the intricate languages of class and status and to see how they and their own migration histories fit into these domestic narratives, these reflections were read as akin to being depressed or angry. More significant, depression and anger were invariably viewed as negative and as negative attributes without any kind of merit. So there was never a situation in which it was good to be like, right, so yes, so you're angry and with reason. I mean, there was never that kind of discussion of the merits of this particular negative affect. So Brazilian and Puerto Rican return migrants faced dramatic embodiments of class and structures of feelings that equated making do with emotional resilience or the lack thereof, and which required enormous self-monitoring and acute attention to interpersonal dialogues, central to the development of new transnational urban competencies. And I wanted to end here. Oops. Oh, there it goes. With something that is seems very different from the work that I've done to this point, but it is very much inspired by the work that I've done so far, so I just wanted to kind of put it out there. As a result of my work on street therapists and some of the follow-up work that I'm working on now, which I just presented, I became interested in further exploring the intersection of class, race, and affect. My past work has looked at the everyday lives and material landscapes of working class US-born and Latin American migrant populations in Chicago and then in Newark. But a rightful critique that colleagues have made of my work is that the mechanics of class and racial privilege have actually taken a backstage to the experiences of marginality in my analysis of inequality. That is, that I have focused on the poverty side of a system from which obviously some individuals clearly benefit. And I became interested in that idea of how affect plays up among the privilege for a long while, and I wasn't able to, I haven't been able to include it. I mean, I've always had to kind of like limit the kind of work that I'm doing for, space constraints and time constraints and all of that. And finally, I think this is something that I just want to move into. Try to explain how are those forms of capital that require certain kinds of emotional dispositions and affective behaviors and perspectives, how are those valued or serve the purposes of the wealthy as well, not only of, to marginalize, but also to create privilege. And because of that, I have decided to continue to use Newark as a generative field site, which is what I come to think of it. I mean, the fact that what motivated this Brazil-Puerto Rico comparison initially was the return migration from this one particular place. But now it's more comparative in a different kind of way. I'm focusing on parental ideologies and parental anxiety, like feelings around parenting that are evoked at a global level in two particular neighborhoods that are considered wealthy neighborhoods in Latin America, one of them being Ipanema and the other one El Condado. And I just barely started this project, so I just did my first kind of stint of field work in Ipanema last summer, and I'm going to do part of it in El Condado in 2 weeks or so. I'm going to be there for part of the winter break. So these are conversations and issues that I continue to be interested in, that I came to them from a very different place, but they continue to inform my understanding, not only of the everydayness and the minutia of those interactions, but also how they play out at a bigger scale in terms of citizenship perspectives, in terms of migration goals, and so forth. So I'm just going to end up here and open up for any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Great. Well, we have lots of time for questions, so please feel free to jump in. If you can identify yourself for Anna's sake, that would be great. And it's the rest of us.
Yes, Deborah.
Deborah Thomas, anthropology studies. Great. And in your book, and you mentioned it a little bit in this talk too, part of the sort of affective landscape around U.S. Blackness is a positive one, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yes.
about hipness and modernity and a knowingness,
Right.
for the kids in Newark. And so I was wondering if you can situate with that same hipness, like is the positive, is it all about depression and
Right.
assimilation and with white Americanness being the purveyor of everything positive, or is there some, do they come back with fashion, do they come back with the kind of popular cultural savvy that's respected?
Absolutely, more so in Brazil than in Puerto Rico, though. I mean, and I feel that maybe because in Puerto Rico that image has been so tremendously racialized, even locally and independently, almost. There are local manifestations of that image that have been racialized. So whenever people come back, there's not that much difference between who left or who hasn't. There's a lot of moving back and forth. So it is not, doesn't have the cachet or the exotic quality, if you will, but in Brazil, definitely it does. I think that it does at the level of practices of consumption, and other people have talked about what those brandings and things like that mean in Brazil to the middle class. So it does from that perspective of what you have on. It does less from the perspective of the cultural capital and the practices, the embodied practices that you carry. So it's less from the perspective of, how you walk a certain way or how your Portuguese is not the best So there's that element there.
I'm interested in Newark as a distinctive site for the return migration, and I was thinking as you were speaking about the ways that this project could shape studies of other ethnic groups in this global economy and neoliberal regime where folks are constantly moving back and forth, and how whether or not the stories of other groups migrating to other places is a similar one of this difficulty of translation and coming up with new emotional repertoires to deal with what they've lost and what they've brought with them. But one of the things that occurred to me thinking about Newark is, how different would your story be if you were to tell it from, say, Miami, right? Which is a city that has maybe less in common with Newark than with some of the other places where you have a Puerto Rican and Brazilian population, really rapidly growing Brazilian population, especially in Miami. Yeah. And whether or not you would expect there to be different, or did you come across kids in the schools you're looking at who had emigrated from or migrated back from other places?
That's a great question, because I think, absolutely, at so many levels it would be different. But I think one of the reasons why it would be different, especially in a case like Miami, it's the class component, because there was even that difference between New York and Newark in the case of Brazilians. So a lot of the Brazilians who are friends of mine, or I know in New York, would tell me, but those Brazilians are really the ones that come from those areas, like the boonies, like they're not the ones, they're not like, they're not like us, like there was from Rio and Sao Paulo. They're like these other, so even at that level, there is a class, educational, regional component. And I noticed that even in Ecuadorian kids, the ones who were from the high, the ones from El Cerro or La Costa, like all these like geographical distinctions that were made there, even at that level. So I think that there would be differences not only because of the actual city composition, what Newark looks like, and the fact that Newark is a predominantly African American city versus a predominantly white city or other kinds of city, or a predominantly Latin American city. But I also think that it is the different kinds of social markings of the populations that gravitate to that city that would also turn all these discussions very differently. But that's definitely, I think, like one of the things that I always tell my grad students now is like, I think anthropology has, for all its claims to comparative work, there's so little of it. I mean, and I totally understand the logistics of the difficulty. It's really difficult, and I think we need to come up with new ways of doing ethnography and be very creative about them. But I think it's so much value, I feel, in doing that kind of very, on the ground kind of comparative work. Yeah.
I have a question about the age of the people who conduct the residency in America, because I wonder if among the parents, the relation of migration, especially the class component, I just wanted to add a little comment, is that in much of this is expressions, I'm South American, in Italy there are even songs about don't be the American. I don't know who put them up, but probably adults, non parla americano, non diverse. So, but I return to my question about how adults react to the returnees.
Right. Yeah, and that's a great question. I did not interview adults in the return places other than the teachers. And so the teachers come with a perspective. So I didn't interview the parents of the return migrant kids. I did interview the parents of the kids in Newark. But to answer the age question, in Newark, I mean, it was like a 10-year ethnography, like ethnographic field work. I started in 2001, and I finished like more or less in like 2000. I think about 2009 or so, or 2010. So the kids that I met initially were probably juniors in high school, and I knew them until they were young adults. So that's just to answer the quick question. So it was like maybe, until into the 20s, and I've stayed in contact with them after. But then when I went to Brazil, the kids that I was interviewing there were all high school age. And I was able to talk informally with their teachers, but I did not really talk much to the adults. I know that at that time, like, things that I sensed were, like different kinds of evaluations of these young people of their parents' choices. And that was something very interesting, because they you would think that teenagers are into their own world and are not thinking too much about their parents. But I felt that especially the return migrants were constantly evaluating their parents' choices, not only choices to return, but the choices to even leave in the first place. So many of them were like, they just left being babas, or like being babysitters, and they went there to be babysitters. Like nothing changed, and they came back with more money, but we don't have any money. So it didn't feel that there was like that promise of this mobility and this wealth accumulation and this, that didn't feel that the migration experience did not deliver on that promise. So I think that the young people were pretty conflicted about their parents' decisions, even from that perspective of leaving.
I have a question about religion and about Christianity, and I'm not sure if it can use your research at all, but I'm thinking about historically the number of interpretations there have been of the function of Christianity and capitalism. In doing some of the work that you're describing here, of on the one hand interpretations that Christianity is something that teaches people these methods of self-control and internal discipline that is required of them, or on the other hand, views of Christianity as this intensely emotionally expressive outlet or a form of collective identification that can lead to political action and resistance. And you're looking here at a context where there are many different forms of Christianity. First of all, Protestantism and Catholicism, different varieties of Latin American Catholicism as well, and presumably there would be white Muslims and really a lot of different forms of religious community that are coming into contact here. And I wonder, how you interpret the significance of religion in relation to people's learning of emotional repertoires, or their the way that they're translated between places.
Right. No, that's a great question, and I'm so glad that you asked because I actually cross off a section that I had on something like that. I'm going to tell you something anecdotal first that I did not research at all. I just witnessed and observed, and then I'll tell you what the other part that I had that I crossed off was. Well, anecdotally, in the Newark context, I was very one of the very dynamic and central aspects of everyday life in Newark was the Protestant churches. These were churches that Brazilians would always talk about their conversion from Catholicism to this Protestantism, and some people actually migrated here knowing a Protestant pastor that was in Brazil at some point, and things like that. There were a lot of connections like with the church as an institutional, in an institutional perspective. That needs to be explored, and I agree. And even in Newark, at a broader, I guess Newark as a whole, I mean, the fact that Black churches have played such a tremendous political role in Newark, right? And how, and yet, it feels like that's another world from the world that these other two neighborhoods belong to, right? I mean, like, I never met anybody that went to a Black church. They went to churches in their local neighborhoods that were tended to be mostly from people from their own ethnicities. Okay, so that's the anecdotal part of it. The reason why I say like what I had talked about, because it wasn't, I had a more extensive description of perspectives on class. Like when I start talking about going back and feeling that you have to relearn this class system, pretty much. What I found very interesting was how much of that class talk felt very Catholic and very biblical. So it was very much like, yeah, we need to be good to the poor. I mean, there was like these meta categories of like, well, the rich are really, like, it's really troubling for the rich because they need to give and they need to be generous, and then we need to be good to the poor. So it was like this very vague concepts that felt very Catholic-driven concepts of poor and poverty as a Catholic narrative more than as a social narrative, distinction. So I did notice that, and that was something that I found very intriguing, but it didn't feel like it had, in these particular cases, the affective resonance that you're alluding to. And that doesn't mean, and of course I didn't go into the churches neither in Newark or in Belo Horizonte or in Santurce. And I totally know that that's part of how it's cultivated. Like, this is not so much in the Catholic Church. I don't know that the Catholic Church has this, I don't know, I mean, like, but there are other churches that definitely activate that kind of emotional intensity. And that becomes how you read yourself based on that visceral experience that you have. And that would be, that's a really interesting, it's an interesting question, how that would play out, whether those dynamics actually filter outside at the affective level. I know that they filter outside at these other levels of the narrative of the poor, of like what you're wearing, and that's something that I talk extensively also in the book, like, all this judgment on, who's the most Brazilian, like what are Brazilians associated with, like this Brazilian sexuality that becomes commodified in very interesting ways, and and all of that in a language of the Protestant churches that they attend or not. Yeah.
So a methodological question for you. So it seems like you did a lot of work in schools, and I just want you to comment maybe on where you located yourself in those schools, either in Newark or in Brazil or Puerto Rico, and kind of what you were trying to look at in terms of practice. You talk about narrative, you talk about kind of the types of categories and that the kids are narrating in terms of describing difference to each other. But in terms of practice and peer group composition and all these kind of practice embodied categorical descriptions, could you maybe talk about how you did that methodologically, how you captured that in your ethnographic work?
And this is something that I continue to, like, I mean, the project which is an article project, what I presented here, I'm co-authoring something with a colleague of mine, Ula Berg, and we are talking about the methodology of affect, like how do you study affect methodologically? How much psychologizing is it okay to, like, is there ever okay to psychologize when you're not, like, and what exactly, how do you know that you're seeing it, right? And is it seeable? Is it like, what are the sensorial aspects of it and all of that? But to answer in terms of purely like just a methodological question, I have been drawn always to schools, and I think it's out of I'm drawn to that age group. I feel very sorry for them. I remember how hard it was. I just feel like tremendous compassion for that age group. So there's an element of that. But I also think, I mean, it's a convenience factor. Like the fact that I know that if I focus on public schools, I will get to, I get the feeling that I will get to everybody, right? I mean, like I will get to kids depending on their documented status, whether they're documented or not. I will get, and you know, in these particular areas, schools really were a good entry point to the rest of the community. So even though I began at schools, I did, you know, so I did different things at schools. At the Ironbound school, which is the majority Portuguese and Brazilian school, I conducted a series of just workshops on college workshops, and I also just conducted workshops on topical workshops that one of the teachers wanted me to help with. So over the course of a year, I was meeting the students in that context maybe for the first year or so. After that, I had already developed a rapport with the students, and I was meeting with them outside. So we're meeting at the pizza place, or I would go to their houses for different parties, or meet their parents and so forth. I was at Rutgers at the time, and I also was very involved in that kind of like, you know, this is what you do to get to college, you know, the college level process with this group. In the Ironbound, I was helping seniors initially with senior projects that they had. So I was also working very directly with them. And I was also working with somebody that led like a women's group. So it was like a young women's group also at this public school. So those are the two kind of roles that I played. In the schools in Belo Horizonte and Santurce, the connections were like, well, I'm sorry, I did, okay, so I said two schools in Belo Horizonte and two in Santurce, one private and one public each. The private schools were Catholic schools, now that remind me, and one of them was the Catholic school that I attended in Puerto Rico. So I went back, and oddly enough, everybody was still there. I was like, wow, my God, you must be like 100 now. You know, but they were very welcoming, and you know, and it was very interesting because even though I had like all the IRB stuff, and I'm like, oh my God, I have all these forms here, nobody asked me for anything. It's like, yeah, come on in, like, you know. And the same thing in Brazil. They were like just, you know, and in that it was very much driven to like, you know, I did focus groups and I did interviews, but I did not do a consistent participant observation. But I think that there are some questions that linger, and that's why we are in this other project that I'm working on now, this article, we are touching specifically of how do you really focus on this. I have to say something. I mean, like, I think that for a long time, I really stayed away from doing any kind of work with emotionality and affect. For many reasons, one of them because it was hard, but the more pressing reason was because I know how it's been used, especially in the populations that I am focusing on, Latinos and Latin-Americans. I mean, Latinos and Latin-Americans have either been presented as completely devoid of affect, just workers that don't think, don't have any feelings, don't have any emotions, or hyper affective. Oh, they're like, you know, Carmen Miranda, like they're, you know, from the Carmen Miranda era onward, like this, like, oh, happy people, you know, like all out there. And so it is, you know, how this can be manipulated and used to justify certain things. And I really wanted to make very clear the distinction between that kind of emotional expressiveness and affect as a sociability, as a way of social engagement that everybody has to necessarily be part of. I mean, without any kind of choice almost. It is not a pre-social conception of affect. I don't feel that these populations have even, you know, like I think that that being pre-social is a privilege of some. I mean, like some people can just have a reaction and not monitor it, and that's a privilege. But I think that for other populations, especially racialized populations, there is that awareness of what I do, what I say in this kind of moment, and it becomes that because that's a, you know, it's what you have to do to just exist in that moment and retain personhood, right? And so I just wanted to put that out there because I know that that's something that sometimes gets confused in discussions like that.
So I was intrigued by what you said about the kids' use of ideas of racial democracy in response to the illegibility of racial affect in Newark among their peers during those 4 years. And I just wonder if you would comment on distinctions that you saw between their appropriations of that used in the U.S. context compared to, number one, what you know of just sort of general racial democracy ideas of Puerto Rico and Brazil. And then number two, how the kids sort of, how you see those discourses operating in place and in the schools back home. Not necessarily just for return migrants, but in general.
No, that's great. That's a great question. And this is what the irony is, right? I mean, the irony is that I expected this discourse of racial democracy to be super dominant and like, yeah, we are a mix of three bloods. Like, I expected that to be the case in Brazil and Puerto Rico. I did not encounter that. I encountered that here. So it's almost like a revamping of a discourse that has been somehow modified in Brazil and in Puerto Rico. And I think in Brazil, at the time of my research, lots of things were going on. I mean, there was, there was the affirmative action quotas, and these students were very attuned to that. I mean, they were in college process. They realized that vestibular, the test that they had to take, was really hard, that they probably wouldn't pass it. Like,
this is why you said the private school students were more.
Yes, exactly. So I did not find either in Puerto Rico or in Brazil anybody who came up with these ideas of we are a mix of the three bloods and da. Nobody. I mean, like in Puerto Rico, I found people that identify very with Rastafarianism, and they were like, I'm from Loíza, and and I'm Rasta, and this is why I'm wearing this button, and this is what, and it was like, or I'm black, and we're, we don't want to admit that there's racism. I mean, there were a lot of, it was very interesting that way. Like, I felt that this discourse has been challenged academically, but I think that has also trickled down in some way, and I don't know, or not trickled down, but I mean, there's new ways of interpreting race at a local level, and that was not so. That's why I was surprised that this was revigorated in Newark, and especially in terms of relationships with blacks. I mean, right? I mean, it was never this thing of racial democracy, because in terms of whites. I mean, it's true, there's that many whites in Newark, but it was very much like, we are accepting, we are above race, we are not so color focused because we have everything in the family, like the whole, so I don't know if that answers your question, but I just felt that was a very interesting flip, almost.
So can I follow up with a historian's kind of clueless
Yes.
methodological question? So would you push them on that? Like the kids in Newark, would you kind of say like, is this something you hear from your parents, or like where does this come from?
Right.
And does your family talk about this way, et cetera?
There was one case in which I told this girl, this young woman, I was like, well, but the Taínos died within like 50 years of Condado, my little thing, but the Taínos died within like 50, and she's like, well, you know what, my father is a Taíno, and there actually was a Taíno group in Newark, so there was a very immediate reference to this, so I was just like, okay, and it was a very spiritual Taíno practice movement, which for a minute, so that was also part of the interesting, that the meaning of the three races were, even though they were deployed in a very traditional way of the three bloodlines that we all have, there were very specific, immediate reference to that to sustain those ideas.
It sounds sort of diasporic more than
yes, no, from that perspective, it definitely is. But in no moment did I sense that there was even among the U.S.-born Puerto Ricans, and maybe this is a Newark thing, and it's definitely not a New York thing. I don't think, but there was not this kind of alliance built, like a sense of we go to school with African American kids that have the same kind of lives that we do, for lots of different reasons, and those resonances were not activated, and I just don't. And for some time, I thought it was because a lot of the personnel of the school that were in security positions, like the security guards and people that dealt with the Panasonic, had monitors and audio all over the schools, and that's something that I talk about in the book. were African American. So I think that there was, you know, I thought, is it like a figure of authority kind of emphasis? Yeah. But yeah.
Hi, I'm Megan Stewart. This is Elma Dackler. My question kind of dovetails on the previous one about methodology, and I was curious about how working on issues like affect and neoliberalism and race, how you characterize your research with participants, meeting them informally. I know in U.S. schools you had kind of a pretext for being there, but how did you talk about what your research interests were with your
Well, the thing is, my research interests were not on affect from the beginning. So initially, I would just tell them the truth, which is like, you know, I'm just interested in knowing what is it like to be a Latino or Latin American student in this school or in this neighborhood. And initially, people were interested, and they, you know, asked a few questions. And the fact that I was from Rutgers was very different. I mean, I was like, I did also studies of I focused on high schools also in my other study, and I was a graduate student when I did my other study in Chicago. And I remember that at that time, you know, like there was less of a connection. I mean, obviously I wasn't part of a university yet. I mean, I was just a graduate student. In this particular case, being part of Rutgers, I think that I was seen as somebody that could be resourceful for, you know, to get more information on college and stuff like that. But at the same time, I do feel that students eventually just forget while you're there. I mean, the fact that you have an adult paying attention, it sounds kind of, but you know, but they just, and it, of course, and it's something that lasted almost 10 years. So with time, you sort of kind of ease into it. So I'm not sure that answers the question, but even if initially it's like something that may be odd, that they're like, why is this person interested? Like eventually, and not even too eventually, just like within a few months probably, just, you know, ease more into, I don't know.
So at the end, after you had settled on kind of doing this big integrated framework as an effect, was there a way in which you talked to them or communicated with them your idea about, you know, street therapy and kind of informal ways of navigating emotionally difficult social stuff? I mean, how did you...
Those conversations happen a lot after that, yes. There were conversations about, I mean, I was drawing more from data that I had. Like, if people had talked to me about their work, I would go back and say, okay, so what are those colleagues like? Like, there was this person that worked at, as a security guard in one of the hospitals after she graduated. And, you know, and I would tell her, you know, so what are the people that you work with like? And then she would go on and tell me, oh my God, they're neurotic. There's this black woman, there's this white woman that is from, you know, from whatever she was, maybe Bloomfield, I don't know. Like there's this white woman coming in, and if she sees that there is a drop on the faucet in the bathroom, she will just go all crazy, like she's neurotic, and this is like, you know, she cannot understand why we talk in a certain way. So, I mean, there will be a lot of that kind of evaluations, and I would probe people on that. But it would be more like asking again about how aspects of their lives are going. I did not at that point just say, okay, I changed my topic and I'm interested in this other thing now.
And not very transparent about like your frameworks.
Yeah, I don't think that I gave, I mean, you know, for me at least, I don't know how other people work, but I mean, for me at least, it's almost like I have all the data first, and then I see the framework coming from it. So I'm working on that kind of framework by noticing the patterns up until the very end, not when the book is going to press, but like shortly before that probably. So it continues to be, you know, to like, so I don't think that at any of the point in the fieldwork process, the active fieldwork methods process, I had a clarity of, oh, that's what this is about. You know, I think that happened more when I looked at my field notes, I looked at the transcripts from the interviews, I looked at the transcripts from the focus groups, I looked at some writings that some students had done. So once I had everything and I was organizing things thematically or trying to figure out what this is about, that's when these kinds of ideas started emerging. So maybe it's the timing of it.
I'm interested in learning more about the notion of desire for urban competence. When we learn in the everyday use of this education,
home country. Maybe that's different than college, fit well.
Mhm.
I was just wondering whether that would be part of the reason why some of the young returnees have problems in these needs with because from what I've read about Japanese returnees from Brazil, or Chinese returnees from Argentina, they learn about these wonderful discourses of diversity and race relations and our relationship when we return to their home country. There's space for them to discuss or continue discussing those issues.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that there is an element of not knowing how to, I mean, it's a language, it's a difference in how you talk about it even, right? And I think that and the fact that, like in the schools here, they are presented with all these possibilities for multicultural discussions, right? So that's part of the school curriculum pretty much of having the multicultural day, having them this and that. It's become very institutionalized in a way that it hasn't necessarily when they go back. So I think that that's part of it. But you know what, in terms of the learning of it, I mean, I think that part of it is an active learning, part of it is performative, even strategic when it's happening here. But it's harder to know what part of it is simply is practice, right? I mean, what part of it is a performative, more strategic, more conscious almost, I don't know. And what part of it is just simply how you view yourself. And I think that, and how you convey that view to others. And how you are able to manage that. And I think that the kids who were more, like there have been studies on like ease, and the concept of ease, right? I mean, like one of the things that people who are privileged in any kind of context learn is how to feel ease wherever they are. And I think the same thing, even though those studies of ease have happened among the elite, I think that kinds of same concepts of ease happen at this level too. For some kids, I mean, these performances are not easy. Not everybody can acquire this, and I think we don't really give credit to how difficult this is, and how not everybody has access to it, right? So I think that the kids that tend to do better are the kids that have access to it, but also is not an access that cannot be turned off. Like they have that kind of very more strategic perspective on it without sounding. So I don't know. I think that the kids who are able to do that are probably in a better position to navigate those new contexts, whether they want to do it or not. And some kids deliberately would decide, especially among the Nuyorican kids, they decided, no, I'm from New York. I mean, like maintaining a Nuyorican identity was important. They did not want to be considered just Puerto Rican from the island. They were from New York. And that became even more pressing to maintain whatever they associated with the New York Puerto Ricanness. But yeah.
I want to come back to your discussion of how migrants in Newark come to grips with African Americans and race. And as you described it, a lot of their understandings of African Americans seem to be from 1 or 2 steps removed. They compete with us for our women. They're aggressive. But I didn't hear a lot about the kind of everyday interactions that are going on in the hallways and extracurricular activities and dating or socializing or not dating or socializing, whatever. So could you say a little bit about that? Because that interests me.
No, definitely. I talk about that in the book. I mean, I think that, there's many cases in the book. I think that one of the things is I did focus on Puerto Ricans and Brazilians, and to a degree other people who are peripheral to the realities of those groups. But I mean, there were many different instances of interactions, and like for instance, in one of the cases, in one of the chapters, I begin with a vignette of an African American woman, middle class, maybe upper middle class, coming to a Brazilian hair salon, and the different kinds of discussions that emerge around that. People in the hair salon saying, like, she came to do her eyebrows, and they didn't do a good job, so she's like, I still have hair in my eyebrow, and some other conversations around that saying, how can she even tell there's a hair? She's so dark. in different kind of languages when she leaves, or references to, oh, this black woman came in and she wanted her blonde hair, and so there were a lot of kinds of discussions around those kinds of interactions. But again, that's not an interaction that is meaningful in the sense of like a friendship, a relationship. I did hear from the part of the Puerto Ricans, like, for instance, girls telling me, once I dated a black guy and I would always be worried that his mother wouldn't like me. So that kind of relationships were the ones that were more meaningful and more ongoing and more intimate. I was just very surprised not to see as much as that, and one thing to emphasize here, there was also a sense of a cooptation of Brazilian culture or ideas of authenticity that came from African Americans, and that Brazilians felt they didn't live up to those expectations. So for instance, there were situations in which, in a capoeira class, this woman telling me, African Americans come to this capoeira class, and this woman is light-skinned, a Brazilian woman. They come to capoeira class and they look at us like we can't be Brazilians, like they're more Brazilians than we are. So there was this assumption, I think, on the part of different kinds of African American patrons of the different commercial areas of the Ironbound that reach out to a more pan-African ideas of commonalities, Pan-African commonalities that were rejected or were viewed as undesirable in some way. So those are just some examples of that. I mean, I know that I have many others throughout the book, but I'm trying to think whether I saw a lot of very intimate relationships between the Italian faculty members left at the teacher at the school in the Puerto Rican area, and African American teachers. But I was actually very surprised. I mean, I don't know. It just felt very different from New York, or maybe I'm just idealizing New York or something. I don't know. It just felt very different from what I had lived in New York. But
just a real quick observation from my own life. I've been there in Leblon and Ipanema, and we talked about Copacabana, and I'm from Philadelphia, and I told you we did this. When I think about people talking to other people, I think we're sort of like plates, tectonic plates. And I think everybody who asks somebody something, especially in an attempt to really know them better, everybody's plates are sliding all the time. Because if I, as the person I am, come from where I come, and I meet someone, the next person who comes somewhat similarly situated and asks the same person another set of questions, like it's kaleidoscopic. The answers shift depend on who is coming from where with what attitude to talk to whom about what they've done and where they've been. It's so interesting. In Brazil, just real quick, two examples. I was in Brazil and I stayed for 6 weeks, and I told you I tried to live there. I went on 2 Embra tours. One Embra tour was Brazilian. It was very nice. Another Embra tour was international. It was as though I was in 2 different countries, on 2 different vehicles, on 2 different planets. Because the Europeans that were generally the tourists in the international set, their interest in Brazil, their interest in what we talked about, everything about how we interacted was so different than everything that was a Brazilian tour of Brazilians, where I was like the outsider. I didn't feel outside, but the whole tour shifted so profoundly. It's just hard to explain. That's all I can think about the experience. And I was so glad you mentioned Ironbound, because I was sitting here thinking about it, and I wanted to hear. Because that's such a peculiar, such an interesting, I don't mean peculiar, strange, I mean idiosyncratic neighborhood in Newark. I'm so glad you mentioned it, because it's the same thing. Do you get the same answers when you go to Newark? I mean, when you go to Ironbound in Newark, as you get from the North Ward or the South Side over where I'm more familiar with Valesburg and Irving. How does it shift when you're in different parts of the city? And
No, I mean, obviously, I mean, like, I think that there's so many ways in which subjectivity just, like, gets reframed in so many, I mean, and not even only in terms of the Brazilian versus the international, but in terms of, you know, along all sorts of other kind of, you know, axis of difference and, you know, yeah, so no, I think, I mean, I don't know that I was, yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you. Like, I think it depends a lot on where you are and the kinds of responses, you know, that you get.
We have time for one last question right over here.
So I have a question, just in thinking about learning race, and so wanting you to sort of perhaps speak a little bit more about how you conceptualize or frame blackness, particularly as a binary or as a dichotomy between Latino identity or Latin American identity. And so thinking about sort of one, how do people from Puerto Rico or Brazilians that you spoke to frame and already have sort of racialized frame of media? And then also one and or sort of another thing is thinking about these categorizations of Black or African Americans that you described to Newark. How are those in conversation or potentially in a position to thinking about the sort of global production of blackness? One that sort of partners with and is inclusive of sort of Brazilian and sort of Puerto Rican identity.
No, absolutely.
But then also, what is that category? Is that African American tradition from the U.S.? Is that African migrants? When how is that Caribbean? Who is Black?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and I think especially in Newark. One of the things I have to say is that the work that I did, again, did not focus on African Americans, so I don't have the African American perspectives on this situation. It was more based on ideas of blackness that were circulated organically. So it was not that I still don't have any particular cohesive ideas or assumptions about blackness, but people did. So it's like dealing with that, and I think that that's one of those things that becomes really hard to dissect, because I felt that there were these ideas provided that you could, like, at any kind of conversation, you would come up with like 20 ways in which what this person just said empirically from the reality of what we know in terms of different kinds of nationalities, in terms of different kinds of neighborhoods, would not hold. But there was a need for some reason among the Latin American migrants especially, but also among the US-born Latinos, to construct this as very cohesive, in very cohesive ways. And I think that that's what I felt that was particularly unexpected. I mean, like, I would have thought that there would be more fluidity in conceptions of blackness, especially when you have such a diverse African American and African and Caribbean Black populations in Newark. And there wasn't. I mean, I feel, and I don't know if it had to do with the levels of segregations, how the neighborhoods are organized, and the people that each person comes in contact with. But there was definitely that sense of blackness as a cohesive entity, and it was a cohesive entity, presented as a cohesive entity that was very mediated in some ways and pathologized in others. And that's what was really revealing, like from the Newark end of things. No, my participants are Brazilians and Puerto Ricans.
They're not Black.
None of them identified as Black, no. And for them, Black meant specifically African Americans, not Caribbean American, not Caribbean Blacks, not Africans, not other Black Latinos, nothing. You know, just specifically that was the reference. Yeah, and it may be that most of the Brazilians that came to Newark were from Minas Gerais. Also, that's not true because I did. Yeah, but I think many of them were from the state of Minas Gerais. And yeah, but even that, I mean, like, so, you know, you have to take into account also like the conceptions of race domestically. Like, maybe if they had come from another part of Brazil, there would be a different kind of perspective on how they self-identify. But in this particular case, there wasn't. But yeah, no, it was very. I did find it very unexpected. And I found it not so unexpected from Brazilians, actually. I found it more unexpected from Puerto Ricans, because I always felt that especially among the US-born generation, I've always felt that there has been more synergy and more complexity in perspectives on who's Black and Black identification, you know, at all levels. And I didn't sense that, not even at the most superficial levels of folklore even. You know, like you can say, well, yeah, they did it, but at this folkloric kind of like, oh, bomba plena type of thing, but not even at that level, which was very, I don't know. But.
Well, thank you very much for
Thank
really
you.
Thank you all for coming, and I remind you again that our last event of this semester is next Friday at this time with lunch served. Dr. Demetriou of the Migration and Policy Institute will be here talking about getting comprehensive immigration reform right. Should be a really interesting presentation, so I hope to see many of you there. And we do have a sign-up sheet if you haven't signed up and want to get onto our list serve. Please do. Thanks.